Sometime in the early 1970s, a former British Royal Air Force policeman turned hairdresser named Ken Small visited the South Devon coast of England for the first time. He was thinking about settling there. The weather was mild, the coastline was beautiful, and a man from Britain's chilly north could be forgiven for finding the place appealing. On his first visit to the Slapton Sands area, he got talking to a local fisherman and diver. The fisherman told him something that would change the course of his life. He said that one of the American tanks used in a 1944 training exercise had sunk when it left its landing craft, and was now lying intact on the seabed about 200 yards offshore. Small was intrigued immediately. Within 24 hours, he had made a decision. Somehow, he would raise that tank and set it up on the shore at Slapton Sands as a memorial to the American servicemen who had died liberating Normandy just across the English Channel. It took him a year just to find out who owned the tank. Eventually, he bought the Sherman from a U.S. government agency for $50, about all he could afford. Then began the problem of actually raising it. 9 years later, he was still searching for the money and the equipment to retrieve a rusting Sherman he had never seen, sitting 65 feet below the surface of the sea, where it had lain since 1944. On Saturday, May 17, 1984, 10 years after Small first heard the fisherman's story, the salvage crews went down and brought the tank up. It was positioned on a hard stand at Slapton Sands just in time for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. The Sherman still sits there today, its cannon pointing out over Start Bay where everything happened. But the recovery of the tank did something Small had not anticipated. It reopened a debate that had been simmering for 40 years. Dark talk about a cover-up, mass graves, trainloads of dead Americans shipped secretly across England under military guard, censorship orders that had supposedly never been lifted. The suggestion that what happened at Slapton Sands in April 1944 was not merely a tragic accident, but two separate disasters, one of them caused not by the Germans, but by the Americans themselves. And at the center of it all was a question that nobody in authority had ever fully answered. If the official account explained everything, why were local residents still finding pieces of American military equipment on the beach decades later? Why did eyewitnesses keep describing things that did not appear in any official record? And why were 3 trains secretly loaded with dead American soldiers at a nearby station in the summer of 1944, moved under military guard to an unknown destination? This is the story of Operation Tiger, the D-Day rehearsal that killed approximately 700 Americans before the real invasion ever began, and the mystery of what exactly killed them. By the spring of 1944, the planning for the Normandy invasion had reached a level of detail and coordination that had no precedent in the history of warfare. General Eisenhower's staff had spent months working through every aspect of the operation: the timing of the tides, the layout of the beach obstacles, the sequencing of the assault waves, the logistics of supplying an army across an open beach in the days before a port was captured. The planning was meticulous, and it required practice. The beaches of Utah Beach and Normandy had specific characteristics: a particular gradient, a particular type of sand, a particular relationship between the waterline at low tide and the defensive positions above the beach. Finding a training location in England that replicated those characteristics closely enough to be useful was not straightforward. The beach at Slapton Sands in South Devon turned out to be the best available option. The shoreline bore a close enough resemblance to Utah Beach that it was worth using despite the significant disruption this caused to the local population. That disruption was substantial. The entire area around Slapton Sands, villages, farms, hundreds of homes, was requisitioned by the military. Local residents were given weeks to leave, taking what they could carry and abandoning what they could not. The land and the shoreline became American military training territory for the duration of the exercise. This was not done callously. The locals were compensated, and the military was grateful for the sacrifice. But it was a significant imposition on communities that had no say in the matter. Operation Tiger was designed to be the final major rehearsal for the Utah Beach landing. It involved approximately 30,000 American soldiers, the 4th Infantry Division, the 71st Tank Battalion, and the 297th Combat Engineers, among others. The exercise was intended to simulate the actual D-Day operation as closely as possible, including the amphibious approach, the beach assault under realistic conditions, and the coordination between the different elements of the force. Realistic conditions, in 1944, military training terminology meant live ammunition. The British Army had been training for the invasion for years, and the doctrine that had developed from that training held that soldiers needed to experience actual fire before they encountered it in combat. Men who had only ever heard training rounds from safe distances tended to freeze or break when they encountered real incoming fire for the first time. The answer was to expose them to live fire in training, carefully controlled, carefully timed, with clearly established safety margins. Terrifying, but effective. Operation Tiger was scheduled for the night of April 27th to 28th, 1944. The assault convoy would approach Slapton Sands from the sea, landing craft would bring the troops ashore, and the coordinated exercise would test whether the training had produced the capability the D-Day planners needed. What nobody in the planning process had adequately accounted for was the possibility that the exercise itself would be attacked. The English Channel, in April 1944, was a contested waterway. German naval forces operated in it. German E-boats, fast, torpedo-armed attack craft capable of 30 knots, were based at Cherbourg on the French coast, barely 100 miles from Slapton Sands. They conducted regular raids against Allied shipping. The planners knew this. The question was whether adequate protection had been arranged for the training convoy. The answer, as events proved, was no. The convoy for Operation Tiger consisted of 8 LSTs, landing ship tanks, large flat-bottomed vessels designed to carry vehicles and troops and drive them directly onto beaches. They were slow, ungainly, and relatively lightly armed. They were also essential to amphibious operations. There was no other practical way to put tanks and heavy vehicles on a beach from the sea. The convoy was supposed to have a protective escort. The original plan called for a British destroyer, HMS Scimitar, to accompany the LSTs during the exercise. But Scimitar had been damaged in a collision and was undergoing repairs. A replacement, HMS Azalea, was assigned. Azalea was a corvette, a smaller, slower vessel than the destroyer it replaced, with less firepower and less speed. Whether the substitution was adequately communicated to all the relevant parties would become a matter of some dispute afterward. There was also a communications problem that would prove fatal. The American convoy and the British escort were operating on different radio frequencies. When Azalea attempted to warn the LSTs of approaching threats, the warning went unheard because the Americans were not monitoring the channel the British were broadcasting on. The German E-boats that sortied from Cherbourg on the night of April 27th had picked up the American radio traffic from the convoy in the English Channel. 9 E-boats from the 5th and 9th Schnellboot flotillas entered the exercise area and found the American convoy essentially unprotected and unaware of their presence. What followed was a disaster in the most direct and human sense of the word. The E-boats fired torpedoes into the LST convoy in the darkness. LST 507 was hit and caught fire. LST 531 was hit by 2 torpedoes and sank in less than 6 minutes. LST 289 was hit but stayed afloat and limped to port. The men aboard those vessels had multiple layers of difficulty to overcome that night, and many of them did not survive the attempt. Life jackets had been incorrectly demonstrated during training. Many soldiers had been shown to wear them around the waist rather than under the armpits, meaning that when men entered the water, the jackets flipped them face down instead of keeping their heads above the surface. Men who might have survived in the water died face down because their life jacket was in the wrong position. The water temperature in the English Channel in late April was approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to produce incapacitation within minutes of immersion. Men in the water had very little time before hypothermia made it impossible to keep swimming or to hold on to floating debris. Some soldiers were wearing full combat equipment: helmets, weapons, ammunition, gear. The weight dragged them down in water that was already cold enough to kill them without assistance. The rescue operation was confused and inadequate. Communications failures meant that other vessels in the area were slow to understand what had happened. By the time rescue craft arrived, many men had already died. The final count of American dead from the E-boat attack was approximately 700 men. The figure is not precise. Different sources give slightly different numbers, and the chaos of the night made accurate accounting difficult. But in the region of 700 Americans died in the English Channel, off the coast of Devon on the night of April 27th to 28th, 1944. More Americans died in that training exercise than would die on Utah Beach on D-Day itself, when the real invasion took place 6 weeks later. Eisenhower's immediate response was to order the recovery of all bodies at all costs and to impose strict information controls on everyone who had been in the area. 10 officers who had been briefed on the full details of the D-Day plan were among the missing. The fear was that they might have been picked up alive by the Germans and might reveal what they knew under interrogation. The search for those specific men was conducted with particular urgency. All 10 were eventually found. All 10 were dead. The question of whether what happened at Slapton Sands was covered up, and if so, how extensively and for how long, has been argued for decades. The honest answer is that it is complicated, and that the word cover-up means different things depending on what you are asking about. What is clear is that in the immediate aftermath of the E-boat attack, the American military imposed strict information controls. Personnel who had been present were instructed not to discuss what had happened. The wounded who were treated at local military hospitals were kept away from civilian contact. Nurses and doctors were told to say nothing. The general operational security requirements of a major invasion 6 weeks away provided a legitimate justification for this. The Allied command genuinely could not afford to have the Germans learn the details of what had gone wrong, which might reveal something about the invasion planning they were otherwise unaware of. This initial information lockdown was real and documented. What became more contested was whether the lockdown ever formally ended, whether it was as complete as rumors suggested, and whether the official accounts published after the war told the full story. The evidence against a sustained cover-up is substantial. Captain Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's personal naval aide, gave a fairly detailed account of the E-boat attack in his memoir published in 1946, only a year after the war ended. The American military's official history of the cross-channel attack, published in 1951, referred to Operation Tiger. Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, published in 1957, also covered the incident. On the first official anniversary of D-Day, General Alfred Gwenther gave a full public account of what had happened at Slapton Sands. The Stars and Stripes military newspaper had even mentioned the incident during the war itself in July 1944, within weeks of D-Day. This is not the behavior of an organization maintaining a complete cover-up. A complete cover-up does not publish accounts in official histories or allow a senior general to describe the incident publicly on the anniversary of the invasion. But the picture is more complicated than that. The official accounts focused almost entirely on the E-boat attack and the sea casualties. They were notably silent about whether anything else had happened. And it is the possibility of something else, a second disaster on the beach itself, separate from the E-boat attack, that drove the persistent rumor and the ongoing controversy that Ken Small's tank recovery reignited in the 1980s. The possibility of a second incident at Slapton Sands, separate from the E-boat attack, occurring on the beach itself rather than at sea, emerged from a number of sources that accumulated over the decades following the war. None of them are individually conclusive. Together, they present a picture that the official accounts have never satisfactorily addressed. Local residents in the Slapton area began reporting, years and then decades after the war, that they had witnessed or heard things inconsistent with the official account. Dorothy Seekings, a local woman, maintained that as a girl, she had witnessed the burial of hundreds of Americans in a mass grave. The BBC investigated this claim and found the farmer on whose land the supposed grave was located. He said he had never seen a single bone in years of plowing his fields. American veterans who had been present began coming forward with accounts of casualties on the beach itself. Some described seeing men mown down by friendly fire, defensive troops who had been given live ammunition to simulate German defenders firing at the incoming assault troops. The claims were specific and came from multiple independent sources over a period of years. In 2004, 60 years after the events, the Observer newspaper published a detailed investigation based on years of reporting. The newspaper's account was striking. It claimed that statements collected over several years revealed that many casualties at Slapton Sands were not caused by the E-boats at all. The Observer quoted American Lieutenant Colonel Edwin West from Baltimore, who said he saw infantrymen being mowed down by their own side. It quoted Joyce Newby, a land girl who said she helped make hundreds of coffin lids at a nearby timber yard for the victims of friendly fire at Slapton. The newspaper's theory was specific. It alleged that as thousands of GIs swarmed ashore from their landing craft, they were cut down by bullets fired by comrades playing the role of German defenders, who had, for some reason, been given live ammunition. The detail about the station master at Kingsbridge, 5 miles from Slapton Sands, was particularly striking. His record showed that 3 trains were secretly loaded with dead American soldiers between July and August 1944, under military guard after the bodies had been exhumed from temporary graves. Where those trains went and where those bodies ended up has never been fully accounted for in the public record. The Pentagon, when repeatedly pressed, maintained a consistent position. The U.S. Center of Military History stated they knew of no official incident other than the German E-boat attack, no beach incident, no friendly fire casualties on land, no second disaster. And yet, the bones of American soldiers continued to be dug up near Slapton Sands in the years following the war, in areas that had nothing to do with the sea. Ken Small himself continued to find pieces of American military equipment on the beach itself, which he found difficult to explain if all the Americans who died had died in the water offshore. To understand whether a second disaster on the beach was physically possible, not whether it happened, but whether it could have happened, you need to understand what live fire training in 1944 actually involved and how precisely timed it had to be to avoid casualties. Live fire training before a major amphibious assault was standard practice in the Allied armies by 1944. The doctrine behind it was born from hard experience. Men who had trained only with blank ammunition and safely observed artillery fire from protected positions tended, in their first real combat, to freeze or break under incoming fire in ways that men who had experienced real fire did not. The answer the training programs had developed was controlled exposure to real fire during the final stages of training, soldiers advancing under carefully timed artillery barrages, with live rounds passing overhead, and then attacking positions defended by expert marksmen, firing live ammunition from carefully calculated angles that were lethal if anyone stepped outside the designated advance corridors, but safe for soldiers who followed the prescribed routes. The precision required to conduct this kind of training safely was significant. The defenders needed to know exactly when the assault troops would be at each position. The artillery needed to be firing on a precise schedule that lifted off the beach as the infantry arrived at the designated point. Everything depended on communications and timing working exactly as planned. Now, consider what the E-boat attack did to the timetable of Operation Tiger. The attack on the convoy disrupted everything. LSTs were sinking or damaged. Radio communications were confused. The orderly sequencing of the assault that the shore-based defenders and artillery had been briefed to expect was thrown into chaos. Soldiers who should have been arriving at precise intervals were arriving at different times, in different conditions, some having survived the attack in the water, some having been diverted to rescue operations, some simply late because the chaos of the attack had broken the convoy's coherence. If the beach defenders, operating on a fixed timetable calibrated for the planned landing schedule, began their live fire sequences at the times they had been briefed and the assault troops arrived at different times than expected, the safety margins built into the exercise could have collapsed. Soldiers arriving early or late, or in positions they should not have been in because the timetable had broken down, would have been in the path of fire that was safe for soldiers following the correct timetable. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of how live fire training accidents happen. The author of the original source article, himself a veteran who went through live fire training in 1944, noted that these exercises were hairy even when well conducted, and that even then there were still casualties. It was only by adhering to clear timetables and strict discipline that such exercises could be conducted without major accidents. Remove the clear timetable, which the E-boat attack did, and the conditions for exactly the kind of accident that the eyewitnesses described were present. The argument that 2 separate disasters could not have happened on the same night, because the coincidence seems too improbable, misunderstands the causal relationship. The beach disaster, if it occurred, would not have been a coincidence occurring alongside the E-boat attack. It would have been a consequence of it. The E-boat attack broke the timetable. The broken timetable, if live fire training was proceeding on the original schedule, created the conditions for the beach casualties. One does not have to believe the two disasters were independent of each other. One has to only believe that the E-boat attack had consequences that rippled through the rest of the exercise in ways that the American command found too embarrassing to publicly acknowledge on top of the E-boat disaster itself. Whether or not a second disaster occurred at Slapton Sands, it is worth examining the institutional logic that would have driven the American military command to suppress information about it if it did. Because the logic is straightforward and the incentives were powerful. The D-Day invasion was 6 weeks away. The entire Allied war effort in Europe depended on it succeeding. The political and military confidence behind the operation had been built on years of preparation, enormous expenditure of resources, and the accumulated credibility of the commanders responsible for its planning. Eisenhower's personal standing, and the standing of the daylight precision, bombing, combined arms, amphibious assault strategy that the entire operation represented, rested on D-Day working. Into this context, the E-boat attack was already a serious problem. 700 Americans dead in a training exercise, an escort that had not been adequate, a communications failure between Allied vessels, the possibility that German naval forces had picked up radio traffic from the convoy and exploited it. All of this, if fully known, would have raised serious questions about the competence of the planning and the protection of the convoy. Adding a second disaster, friendly fire casualties on the beach caused by the same training exercise breaking down because of the same E-boat attack, would have been exponentially worse, not simply because of the additional casualties, but because of what it suggested about the quality of the training program itself. If American soldiers died in training because their own exercise fell apart catastrophically under the pressure of an unexpected German attack, what did that say about their readiness to perform the same exercise under far greater German opposition on D-Day itself? The answer to that question would have terrified Allied commanders in April 1944. 6 weeks before the invasion, any information that raised serious doubts about the readiness of the forces or the adequacy of the planning could have had political consequences in London and Washington that would have been very difficult to manage. Eisenhower and his staff had spent enormous energy persuading Churchill, Roosevelt, and the combined chiefs of staff that Overlord was ready. They did not need a catastrophic training failure undermining that confidence at the worst possible moment. The decision, if a decision was made, to use the E-boat disaster as the explanation for all casualties at Slapton Sands would have been institutionally comprehensible, even if it was not honest. The E-boat attack was real. The casualties from it were real. Attributing all the casualties to it avoided the need to explain a second incident that reflected more directly on American command and training failures. This is the theory Charles Whiting, the article's author, advanced. Someone perhaps decided that there should be no attempt at an explanation of the second disaster. Instead, the matter should be covered up. They would use tragedy number 1 to conceal tragedy number 2. Whether that is what happened remains unproven. The Pentagon has never acknowledged a beach incident. The eyewitness accounts remain contested. The 3 trains and their cargo remain unexplained in the official record. And the bones that have been found in the years since near Slapton Sands have not been officially connected to any incident the military acknowledges. Ken Small died in 2004, the same year the Observer published its investigation into Slapton Sands. He had spent 30 years of his life on the story, buying the Sherman tank for $50, raising it from the sea floor after 10 years of effort, publishing his book, The Forgotten Dead, and advocating for recognition of the Americans who died in the waters off Devon in April 1944. He never fully resolved the questions he had helped bring back into public attention. The Sherman tank still sits at Slapton Sands, its cannon pointing out over Start Bay. It is a memorial to the men who died in the E-boat attack, and to the broader sacrifice of the American forces who trained on that stretch of English coastline before crossing the Channel to Normandy. It is one of the few visible monuments to Operation Tiger and to the disaster that attended it. What remains unresolved after all the investigations and the years of reported eyewitness testimony and the Pentagon's consistent denials is the question Whiting posed at the end of his account of the affair. Where did the bodies go? The 3 guarded trains that left Kingsbridge Station in the summer of 1944, carrying exhumed American dead to an unknown destination. Where did those men end up? If they were simply transferred to recognized military cemeteries as part of routine wartime handling of battle casualties, the records should show it. If the records do not show it, or if they have not been made available for examination, then the question remains open. The American military's position has been consistent. The only incident they acknowledge at Slapton Sands is the German E-boat attack. No beach incident, no friendly fire casualties, no second disaster. The bodies found on and near the shore over the years, the fragments of equipment Ken Small kept finding on the beach, these are, in the official account, explained by the sea itself, by the movement of bodies and debris from the E-boat attack area toward the shore over time. This explanation is physically possible. It is also not entirely satisfying to everyone who has examined the evidence. The persistence of eyewitness accounts from multiple independent sources, spread across decades, describing casualties on the beach itself, not in the water, not from the E-boats, but from fire coming from American defenders positioned on the shore, creates a body of testimony that the official account has not explained away so much as declined to engage with. The honest position, at this distance from the events, is uncertainty. The E-boat attack happened. 700 Americans died. That much is documented and acknowledged, and the tragedy is real, regardless of whether anything else occurred, whether a second incident on the beach added to that toll, whether the broken timetable created by the E-boat attack fed into a friendly fire disaster among soldiers who were following a live fire exercise schedule that the attack had made dangerous, remains genuinely unclear. What is clear is that Operation Tiger deserves to be better known than it is. 700 Americans died in April 1944, before D-Day, in a training exercise in England. They died because the E-boat attack was not prevented. They died because the escort arrangements were inadequate. They died because life jackets had been incorrectly demonstrated, and because the water was cold, and because communications between Allied vessels failed at the worst possible moment. They died 6 weeks before the invasion they were training for, in a stretch of English Channel between Devon and the French coast, in the dark. They are not remembered the way the men who died on June 6th are remembered. They do not have the same place in the national memory of the war. In some ways, they are the definition of what military history tends to lose. The men who died in the preparation, whose sacrifice did not come at the famous moment, but at the unglamorous rehearsal, whose deaths were absorbed into the vast accounting of the war, without the recognition that the timing and the circumstances denied them. Ken Small understood this when he spent 10 years raising a tank from the seafloor for $50. He was not a historian. He was a hairdresser from the north of England who heard a fisherman's story and could not let it go. And the thing he understood, without needing to be a historian, was that the men who died at Slapton Sands deserved to be remembered by more than a rusting Sherman at the bottom of the sea. He gave them the Sherman on the shore. The questions he could not answer remain open. Approximately 700 Americans died at Slapton Sands in April 1944, more than died on Utah Beach on D-Day itself. The Pentagon has never acknowledged any incident beyond the E-boat attack. The 3 trains that left Kingsbridge Station under military guard in the summer of 1944 have never been accounted for in the official record. The bones of American soldiers have been found near the shore for decades. The tank sits there still. There is a Sherman tank sitting on a hard stand at Slapton Sands in South Devon, England. Its cannon points out over Start Bay. The sea behind it is calm most days, blue-gray in the English light, the kind of water that looks peaceful until you know what happened in it. 700 Americans died in that water in April 1944, more than would die on Utah Beach 6 weeks later when the real invasion came. They died in a training exercise. They died because the escort was inadequate and the communications failed, and the E-boats found them in the dark, and the life jackets had been demonstrated incorrectly, and the channel was cold enough to kill a man in minutes. They died preparing for something that history would remember in enormous detail, while their own deaths remained, for decades, almost unknown. A hairdresser raised that tank. Not a general, not a government, not a memorial commission. A man named Ken Small who heard a fisherman's story and spent $50 in 10 years and most of the energy of his adult life making sure that something visible stood on that shore to say that something happened here, that men died here, that it mattered. He never fully solved the mystery he helped reopen. The 3 trains are still unaccounted for. The Pentagon still acknowledges only the E-boat attack. The bones that have been found near the shore over the years have not been officially connected to any incident the military recognizes. The questions that Dorothy Seekings and Edwin West and Joyce Newby and the station master at Kingsbridge tried to answer with their testimonies, those questions are still open. History does not always close neatly. Sometimes it ends with a tank on a beach and a set of questions that the official record will not answer, and a fisherman's story that one man could not let go of for 30 years. If this story is the kind of history you want to keep finding, the kind that lives in the gaps between what was officially acknowledged and what the people who were there actually saw, then the most useful thing you can do right now is subscribe to this channel. Every subscriber makes it more likely that the next story gets found and told. That is genuinely how this works. If Operation Tiger is something you had never heard of before today, leave that in the comments. And if you know something about Slapton Sands that this documentary did not cover, if you have family connections to Operation Tiger, if you know something about where those 3 trains went, if you have any piece of this story that belongs in the record, leave that too. These stories get completed by the people who watch them. Like the video if it earned it. Share it if you think someone else should know that 700 Americans died in a training exercise 6 weeks before D-Day and spent 40 years being almost forgotten. Ken Small remembered them with a tank. This is how we remember them now.